Welcome to Mind and Might, where powerful ideas ignite your mind and fuel your strength. In the depths of human consciousness lies a truth so profound, so unsettling, that most choose to live their entire lives avoiding its stark reality. We drift through our days feeling empty, disconnected, as if something essential has been severed from our very souls. We consume endlessly, scroll mindlessly, chase hollow achievements, yet the void only deepens. What if I told you that this modern malaise, this spiritual bankruptcy that plagues millions, was predicted over a century ago by one of history's greatest minds? Carl Gustav Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who dared to map the darkest territories of the human psyche, understood something that our hyperconnected, digitally obsessed world has forgotten. He saw that beneath our civilized veneer, beneath our technological prowess and material abundance, we were becoming spiritually impoverished. Jung recognized that modern man was losing his connection to the very forces that give life meaning, purpose, and depth. The emptiness you feel, the restless anxiety that haunts your quiet moments, the sense that you're living someone else's life, these are not personal failings. They are the symptoms of a collective spiritual crisis that Jung foresaw with frightening accuracy. We have traded our souls for safety, our authenticity for acceptance, our inner wisdom for external validation. Over the next minutes, we will descend into the shadow of Jung's most disturbing insights about modern existence. This is not merely an intellectual exercise. This is a confrontation with the uncomfortable truths about why you feel lost, why happiness feels elusive, and why, despite all our progress, we seem to be regressing into a state of psychological infancy. Prepare yourself, for the knowledge you are about to receive will shatter the comfortable illusions that keep you trapped in mediocrity. The first truth: the death of the sacred Jung understood that modern civilization's greatest tragedy was not war, poverty, or disease, but the systematic destruction of the sacred dimension of human experience. We have become, in his words, rational animals who have lost touch with the numinous forces that once gave our ancestors meaning and purpose. The ancient connection between the human soul and the divine has been severed by the blade of scientific materialism. This loss runs deeper than mere religious decline. Jung observed that when we reject the sacred, we don't become more rational, we become more unconscious. The energies that were once channeled through ritual, myth, and spiritual practice don't disappear. They sink into the unconscious where they fester and corrupt. Without a conscious relationship to the transcendent, we become prey to the very forces we thought we had conquered. Consider the fall of Rome, not through military defeat, but through spiritual decay. As the Roman elite abandoned their traditional gods and ancestral customs in favor of foreign cults and philosophical materialism, they lost the cultural spine that had made them great. Citizens became consumers, warriors became bureaucrats, and the sacred fire that had forged an empire was reduced to the cold ash of administrative efficiency. The empire collapsed not because it lacked resources or military might, but because its people had lost their souls. In our time, we see the same pattern. We have churches, but they are empty. We have universities, but they produce graduates who know everything except how to live. We have therapists, but depression and anxiety reach epidemic proportions. We have turned the sacred into the secular, the mysterious into the manageable, the divine into the data, and in doing so, we have created a generation of spiritual orphans who wander through life seeking meaning in all the wrong places. The arsenal against this spiritual poverty begins with recognition. Acknowledge that your emptiness is not a personal deficiency, but a cultural wound. Begin to cultivate what Jung called a religious attitude toward life. Not necessarily through organized religion, but through a conscious recognition that existence contains dimensions beyond the material and the rational. The second truth: the tyranny of persona. Jung revealed that most people spend their entire lives trapped in what he called the persona, the social mask we wear to fit into society's expectations. But here lies the dark truth. The more perfectly we wear this mask, the more we lose touch with our authentic self. Modern life doesn't just encourage this deception, it demands it with ruthless efficiency. The persona becomes a prison precisely because it works so well. It brings social approval, professional success, romantic attention. Society rewards those who can perform their assigned roles with conviction. But Jung warned that when the persona becomes too rigid, too dominant. The authentic self begins to atrophy like an unused muscle. We become what others expect us to be, and in the process, we forget who we actually are. This psychological mechanism explains why so many successful people suffer from profound depression and anxiety. They have mastered the art of being what others want them to be, but they have no idea who they are beneath the performance. The executive who suffers a nervous breakdown at 40, the popular student who attempts suicide, the perfect mother who drinks herself to sleep. These are the casualties of persona tyranny. Look to the myth of Narcissus, not as a story of vanity, but as a warning about the dangers of falling in love with your own reflection. Narcissus became so entranced with his image in the water that he forgot to eat, drink, or live. He died gazing at his own reflection. Modern man faces the same fate, becoming so obsessed with his social image, his online persona, his professional identity, that he loses touch with the living waters of his own soul. In contemporary life, social media has weaponized this ancient psychological trap. We curate perfect lives for public consumption, while our inner lives decay in isolation. We collect likes, followers, and social validation, while our authentic selves scream silently for recognition. The dopamine hit of external approval becomes more important than the quiet satisfaction of self-acceptance. The path beyond persona tyranny requires courage to disappoint others in service of your authentic nature. Begin practicing what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, rather than who you think you should be. Start small. Express an unpopular opinion. Pursue an interest that doesn't fit your image. Say no to social expectations that violate your inner truth. The third truth, the collective possession. Perhaps Jung's most terrifying insight was his understanding of how easily individuals could become possessed by collective forces, ideologies, movements, mass hysteria that override individual consciousness and turn rational people into fanatics. Modern technology has not freed us from this ancient danger. It has amplified it beyond anything Jung could have imagined. Jung observed that when people lack a strong individual identity, they become vulnerable to what he called psychic epidemics, collective possessions that spread through communities like viruses. The individual ego, weak and uncertain, seeks strength by merging with the crowd. But this merger comes at a terrible cost: the loss of individual judgment, moral responsibility, and authentic choice. This psychological mechanism explains how ordinary Germans became complicit in the Holocaust, how reasonable people got swept up in witch trials, how modern individuals can become radicalized by online communities. The possessed individual feels powerful and righteous, but they have actually surrendered their sovereignty to forces beyond their control. Witness the tragedy of the French Revolution, where rational Enlightenment ideals devolved into the terror. Men who had once debated philosophy in salons became bloodthirsty zealots who sent thousands to the guillotine. Robespierre himself, the architect of virtue, became so possessed by his own ideology that he could no longer distinguish between justice and vengeance. He died by the same instrument of virtue he had used to kill others, victim of the very collective madness he had helped create. In our digital age, this phenomenon has reached unprecedented scale and speed. Social media algorithms create echo chambers that amplify our existing beliefs while filtering out contradictory information. We become possessed not by ideas we have carefully considered, but by emotional reactions that feel righteous and urgent. The comment section becomes the Colosseum, and we gladly throw our neighbors to the lions for the crime of disagreeing with our collective truth. The antidote to collective possession lies in cultivating what Jung called conscious suffering, the willingness to bear the tension of uncertainty rather than seeking the false comfort of ideological certainty. Question your strongest beliefs, especially those that make you feel morally superior to others. Seek out perspectives that challenge your worldview. Remember that the moment you stop thinking for yourself, you become a vessel for forces that care nothing for your individual well-being. The fourth truth, the shadow integration crisis. Jung's concept of the shadow represents perhaps his most psychologically sophisticated insight into human nature. That which we deny, repress, or refuse to acknowledge about ourselves doesn't disappear. It grows stronger in the darkness of the unconscious. Modern life, with its emphasis on positive thinking, personal branding, and social acceptability, has created a generation of people who are terrified of their own shadow. The shadow contains not only our repressed negative traits, but also our undeveloped potential, our authentic emotions, and our instinctual wisdom. When we refuse to acknowledge these aspects of ourselves, they don't simply vanish. They begin to control us from the unconscious. We become what Jung called unconsciously identical with our rejected aspects, acting them out in ways that we cannot see, but that are obvious to everyone else. This dynamic explains the phenomenon of projection, how we see in others exactly those qualities we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. The person who constantly criticizes others for being selfish is usually blind to their own selfishness. The individual who sees conspiracies everywhere is often unconsciously plotting their own manipulations. The one who cannot tolerate aggression in others is typically sitting on a volcano of repressed rage. Consider the myth of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, not as a supernatural horror story, but as a precise psychological diagnosis. Jekyll, the respectable Victorian gentleman, tried so hard to be good that he created a monster in his own unconscious. Hyde was not an alien force, but Jekyll's own shadow, grown grotesque through repression and denial. The more Jekyll tried to eliminate his darkness, the more powerful and destructive it became. This pattern manifests everywhere in modern life. The politician who campaigns on family values while conducting secret affairs. The spiritual teacher who preaches compassion while treating their students with contempt. The social justice warrior who fights oppression while bullying anyone who disagrees with them. These are not hypocrites in the conventional sense. They are unconscious people acting out their shadow while believing they are being virtuous. The integration of the shadow requires brutal honesty about your own capacity for evil, selfishness, and destruction. This doesn't mean acting on these impulses, but rather acknowledging them consciously so they don't control you unconsciously. Begin by noticing what triggers your strongest emotional reactions in others. These reactions are usually shadows of your own rejected aspects. Transition point, the deeper descent. We have now established the fundamental psychological mechanisms that keep modern individuals trapped in spiritual poverty. You have learned about the death of the sacred, the tyranny of persona, the danger of collective possession, and the crisis of shadow integration. These are the defensive measures, the recognition of what is working against your authentic development. But recognition alone is insufficient. Jung understood that true psychological transformation requires more than insight. It demands what he called active imagination and confrontation with the unconscious. The next phase of our journey ventures into more dangerous territory, the active methods for reclaiming your authentic self from the forces that have colonized your psyche. What I am about to share with you are not merely therapeutic techniques, but initiatory practices that can fundamentally alter your relationship to reality itself. These approaches carry psychological risks for those who are not prepared to face the full spectrum of their own nature. But for those who have the courage to proceed, they offer the possibility of genuine liberation from the collective sleep that passes for normal life. Part 2. The Advanced Practices. The fifth truth. Active imagination as rebellion. Jung discovered that one of the most powerful methods for reclaiming psychological sovereignty was what he called active imagination, a disciplined practice of dialoguing with the unconscious contents of the psyche. But this is not the passive visualization taught in popular psychology. It is an active confrontation with the autonomous forces that operate within your own mind. Most people live their entire lives as passive recipients of their own thoughts and emotions, never questioning where these mental contents originate or whether they serve their authentic interests. Active imagination reverses this dynamic, turning you from a victim of unconscious forces into a conscious participant in the drama of your own psyche. The practice requires you to personify the different voices, impulses, and energies that you experience internally, then engage them in direct dialogue as if they were separate beings. This is not psychosis, but rather a recognition that the psyche naturally organizes itself around multiple autonomous complexes, each with its own agenda and intelligence. Jung himself practiced this method during his own psychological crisis, recorded in what became known as the Red Book. When he felt overwhelmed by dark visions and disturbing fantasies, instead of suppressing them or seeking medication, he entered into dialogue with these forces. he discovered that what seemed like symptoms of mental illness were actually attempts by his unconscious to communicate crucial information about his life direction and spiritual development. The ancient oracle of Delphi operated on similar principles. The Pythia did not simply dispense advice. She entered into an altered state of consciousness where she could access knowledge beyond her ordinary awareness. The Greeks understood that wisdom often comes not from rational analysis, but from dialogue with forces that operate beyond the ego's limited perspective. In our therapeutic culture, we have been taught to treat uncomfortable emotions and disturbing thoughts as problems to be solved rather than messengers to be heard. We medicate anxiety instead of asking what it is trying to protect. We suppress anger instead of discovering what boundaries it is trying to establish. We avoid depression instead of exploring what parts of our lives have become deadened and need to be grieved. Active imagination requires setting aside time to enter into conscious dialogue with these inner forces. Begin by identifying a persistent emotional pattern or recurring inner voice that troubles you. Instead of trying to eliminate it, personify it and ask it direct questions. What do you want from me? What are you trying to protect? What would happen if I ignored you completely? Listen for responses that come not from your rational mind, but from a deeper, more autonomous source. The sixth truth. The dangerous gift of solitude. Modern civilization has weaponized social connection against authentic self-development. We are never alone with our own thoughts, never forced to confront the silence where true self-knowledge emerges. Jung recognized that solitude was not merely a luxury, but a spiritual necessity. The crucible where the authentic self is forged in the fire of direct self-encounter. But solitude in the Jungian sense is not simply being physically alone. It is the courage to withdraw from collective opinions, social expectations, and external validation long enough to discover what you actually think, feel, and value when no one is watching. This kind of radical solitude terrifies most people because it strips away the comfortable illusions that keep them feeling safe and accepted. The depth of your character can be measured by how much solitude you can tolerate without seeking distraction. Most people cannot be alone with their thoughts for more than a few minutes without reaching for their phone, turning on music, or finding some other form of mental escape. This compulsive need for stimulation reveals how little they actually know or trust themselves. Jung spent considerable time in what he called creative solitude, building stone structures with his own hands, carving images from stone, and recording his inner experiences without concern for how others might judge them. These practices were not hobbies, but spiritual disciplines designed to strengthen his connection to his own authentic nature, rather than his social persona. Consider the story of the Buddha's enlightenment, which occurred not in community but in radical solitude under the Bodhi tree. For 49 days he sat alone, confronting every temptation, fear, and illusion that the mind could generate. The demons that assaulted him were not external forces but projections of his own unconscious contents: doubt, desire, fear, grandiosity. Only by facing these forces alone, without support or distraction, could he achieve the psychological independence necessary for genuine wisdom. In our hyperconnected age, this kind of solitude has become almost impossible to achieve. We carry devices that ensure we are never more than seconds away from social input. We have created a civilization that systematically prevents the kind of deep self-encounter that produces psychological maturity and spiritual insight. The practice of conscious solitude requires more than simply turning off your devices. It demands the willingness to face whatever arises in the silence: boredom, anxiety, uncomfortable memories, difficult emotions, without seeking escape or comfort. Begin by spending time each day in complete solitude, without entertainment, social media, books, or music. Notice how quickly you want to escape this encounter with yourself, and use that discomfort as information about how dependent you have become on external stimulation for your sense of well-being. The seventh truth. The individuation. Imperative. Jung's concept of individuation represents perhaps the most radical and dangerous idea in all of psychology. That each person has a unique psychological destiny that cannot be fulfilled by following collective paths or social expectations. Individuation is the process of becoming who you actually are rather than who you think you should be. A journey that inevitably brings you into conflict with the collective values of your time. Most people never individuate because the process requires sacrificing social approval, security, and the comfortable illusion that they can live their lives without making difficult choices. Individuation demands that you take responsibility for your own psychological development rather than expecting others, parents, teachers, therapists, spiritual leaders, to provide you with ready-made meaning and direction. The individuated person becomes what Jung called a law unto themselves, not in the sense of moral relativism or selfish indulgence, but in the recognition that their highest ethical duty is to fulfill their own unique potential rather than conforming to external expectations. This creates a fundamental tension with collective society, which depends on individuals accepting standardized roles and predictable behaviors. Jung observed that every individuated person must eventually face what he called the sacrifice of the persona, the conscious decision to disappoint others in service of their authentic development. This is not selfishness, but rather the recognition that playing false roles, however socially rewarded, ultimately serves no one's genuine interests. The myth of Christ's crucifixion can be understood as a symbolic representation of the individuation process. Christ was killed not because he was evil, but because he refused to conform to the religious and political expectations of his time. His individuation brought him into fatal conflict with the collective consciousness of his era. Yet this apparent destruction became the foundation for a spiritual transformation that influenced millions. Modern examples of individuation are often found among artists, innovators, and visionaries who sacrifice security and social acceptance to pursue their authentic vision. Van Gogh died in poverty and isolation, never selling more than one painting during his lifetime. Yet his refusal to paint what others expected created works of such authentic power that they continue to transform viewers more than a century later. The individuation process cannot be rushed or forced. It unfolds according to its own internal logic and timing, but it can be supported through practices that strengthen your connection to your own inner authority rather than external validation. Begin by identifying decisions you have made primarily to please others rather than honor your own authentic impulses. Notice how much of your energy goes toward maintaining an image rather than developing your genuine capacities. The eighth. Truth, the transcendent function. Jung's most sophisticated psychological concept was what he called the transcendent function, the psyche's natural ability to create new possibilities by holding the tension between opposing forces rather than choosing one side or the other. This function represents the highest expression of psychological maturity and offers the key to transforming conflict into creativity. Most people, when faced with psychological tension or conflicting desires, immediately try to eliminate the discomfort by choosing one side or the other. They decide they are either good or bad, spiritual or material, rational or emotional. But Jung discovered that this either-or thinking prevents psychological growth and keeps individuals trapped in static patterns. The transcendent function operates through what Jung called holding the tension of opposites, the willingness to experience conflicting impulses, values, or perspectives without immediately resolving the tension through premature choice or action. This psychological patience allows new possibilities to emerge that transcend both sides of the original conflict. This principle explains why Jung was suspicious of any psychology or philosophy that promised simple answers or easy solutions. He understood that psychological truth is paradoxical and that genuine wisdom often requires holding contradictory truths simultaneously. The person who can embrace both their light and their shadow, both their strength and their vulnerability, both their individuality and their connection to others, develops a psychological flexibility that cannot be achieved through one-sided development. Consider the legend of King Solomon's wisdom in judging between two women who both claimed to be the mother of the same child. Rather than trying to determine which woman was telling the truth, Solomon proposed cutting the child in half. The transcendent solution emerged when the real mother revealed herself by being willing to give up the child rather than see it harmed. Solomon's wisdom lay not in choosing between the two claims, but in creating a situation where the truth could reveal itself. In psychological terms, the transcendent function allows you to move beyond the limited perspectives of your ego and access a more comprehensive view of your situation. Instead of being trapped in either-or thinking, you develop the capacity for both and consciousness that can hold complexity without being overwhelmed by it. The cultivation of the transcendent function requires practicing what Jung called conscious suffering. the willingness to bear psychological tension without immediately seeking relief through action, substances, or distraction. When you feel pulled in opposite directions, instead of quickly choosing one side, spend time exploring both impulses fully. What does each side want? What would you gain and lose by choosing either option? Often, a third possibility will emerge that honors both sides of the conflict in a creative synthesis. Conclusion: the Great Synthesis. We have journeyed through the darkest territories of Jung's psychological landscape, confronting truths that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. You have learned about the spiritual bankruptcy of modern existence, the tyranny of social masks, the danger of collective possession, and the crisis of shadow integration. You have discovered advanced practices for reclaiming your psychological sovereignty: active imagination, conscious solitude, the individuation imperative, and the transcendent function. Together, these insights form a complete system for psychological liberation, a path out of the collective sleep that passes for normal life in our time. Jung understood that modern civilization, for all its technological marvels and material comforts, was creating a generation of psychological children who had never learned to think, feel, or choose for themselves. The emptiness you feel, the restless dissatisfaction that haunts your quiet moments, the sense that you are living someone else's life, these are not personal failures but symptoms of a collective spiritual crisis. You have been taught to seek solutions in external achievements, social connections, and material possessions, when the real work can only be done in the depths of your own psyche. But this knowledge comes with a grave responsibility. Jung warned that psychological insight without ethical development leads to inflation and spiritual tyranny. The techniques I have shared with you are powerful tools for personal transformation, but they can also be misused to manipulate others or to justify selfish behavior. The person who knows these principles but uses them only for personal gain becomes what Jung called a clever devil, technically sophisticated but morally underdeveloped. Use this knowledge first and foremost for your own individuation. Become the person you were meant to be, rather than who others expect you to be. But remember that true individuation ultimately serves not only your own development, but the evolution of human consciousness itself. Every person who refuses to live unconsciously, who insists on authentic self-development despite social pressure to conform, contributes to the collective awakening that our world desperately needs. The path of individuation is lonely and difficult, but it is the only path that leads to genuine fulfillment and psychological freedom. You cannot live an authentic life while remaining unconscious. You cannot find lasting happiness while wearing a mask. You cannot develop wisdom while avoiding the difficult truths about your own nature. Jung's dark truth about modern life is simultaneously a diagnosis and a cure. Once you understand the forces that keep you trapped in psychological infancy, you gain the power to choose a different path. The question is not whether you have the ability to individuate. Every human being possesses this potential. The question is whether you have the courage to begin. In the comments below, share which of Jung's insights resonates most powerfully with your own experience of modern life. Have you felt the spiritual emptiness he described? Do you recognize the tyranny of your own persona? Are you willing to begin the difficult but essential work of psychological individuation? If this exploration of depth psychology has awakened something in you, subscribe to continue this journey into the hidden territories of human consciousness. Your subscription tells me that you are ready to confront uncomfortable truths in service of authentic transformation. And if this content has provided value in your own process of awakening, let me know with a like. Your engagement helps ensure that these essential teachings reach others who are ready to stop sleepwalking through their lives and begin the sacred work of becoming who they truly are.